Good morning, Scott Bradner. Thank you so much for being here. Scott, I'm going to formally introduce you. You've been involved in the design, operation, and use of data networks at Harvard University since the early days of the ARPANET. Scott, I want to start at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
Foxborough, Massachusetts, long before the Patriots started playing there.
What were your passions as a kid that translated into being a pioneer of the internet?
I was just a random kid. The main thing that I was known for was pyrotechnics, in the sense of doing things like making a fake atomic bomb, setting it off in the middle of a lake across the street from a house, and things like that.
A fake atomic bomb?
That's a 5-gallon drum of gasoline with explosive in it.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you weren't just any average kid.
Well, the neighborhoods thought I was, they knew what was going on anyway.
So you grew up in Massachusetts, which is where you are now. How'd you decide to go to Harvard?
The first job out of BU was at Dana-Farber as a lab technician. I got into a pissing contest with my then boss, and he suggested I move on. And I got I asked a postdoc for a recommendation. She introduced me to her husband, who was in the technology area, and he hired me as a programmer, even though I had actually never done any programming before. I worked at the company he was at for a couple of years, and then went back to BU for a while, and then left BU again, and then went to look for a job and wound up at Harvard.
So what was your undergrad in? I mean, at that time, what was even available in the area of?
Nothing. I majored in biology at BU.
Where did you start out your professional career?
At Harvard, at what was called a computer-based lab in the psychology department at Harvard. It was a PDP-4-based laboratory. Did operant conditioning, and things like pigeons in little boxes pecking on keys, and babies watching screens and things like that. Wound up putting together, the lab put together a timeshare computer. Digital Equipment Company's first timeshare computer is called a PDP-9T. And I set up the system so that people could use it to do word processing at a time when PCs didn't exist, and people wanted to write theses in mixed English and Greek and things like that. So I set up the system to allow that, and ran cables through the steam tunnels to let them work from their offices. When this networking stuff came along, you could run one cable and satisfy multiple customers rather than one cable per customer. And that's how I got into networking.
So can you better describe the tech scene at that time? Because you were truly part of the early internet days at Harvard. And basically you were the gateway for all internet connectivity for Harvard.
Well, this was long before the internet. Started out with UUCP and the ARPANET. The ARPANET came to Harvard in about 1971. And I got an account on the ARPANET gateway machine. Then UUCP came along a few years later, and the connection to Harvard for the UUCP network was through my computer at that point at 1144 at the psychology department, and I was the gateway to the university for UUCP, and distributed UUCP email and news groups throughout the university, and gateway to the ARPANET. And then later on, when in '83, when we got an internet connection, a non-ARPANET connection to NSFNet. That came through my lab as well.
So what were the conversations during that time that your constituents were having about the ARPANET and the very early underpinnings of what would become the internet?
Bitnet was the big one because it went to universities all over the world. I remember that the people at the divinity school were tickled pink when they should send email to people in Israel who are working on Harvard Studies in Classics, old Coptic literature and things like that. And so that was the first introduction for most people to email was UUCPnet and Bitnet.
When did you get your first email address?
71.
71. Is it the same address still?
Well, at that point, the computer name was Harv10, but the username SOB has been that ever since.
What were your thoughts at that time of like the potential of communication?
I never thought that regular people would use this stuff because it took magic, right? Other than email. Email's fine, but email was relatively limited functionality in the early days. You could send text messages. Later on, you could attach things to it, but early days you couldn't. You could do some file transfer, but it was pretty straightforward. So my biggest surprise of the internet was when my mom started surfing. I never thought that my mom would ever use this stuff because she wasn't technical and she didn't have the magic incantations necessary to make use of it. When the web came along in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, that made all the difference in the world because regular humans could use it.
That's so interesting. When mom started using the internet, that's when you knew it was serious. I love that.
I knew it was exploding then. When Berners-Lee did the web, it meant that you didn't need special training to make use of it and to make use of the net. And that made all the difference in the world. The explosion in use after that was amazing. Even before then, the use of the net was doubling every few years, maybe even every year for a while. But the absolute number grew so fast after the web started being deployed. All the way back to the Silicon Valley wine auction in 93 or 94. And since then, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
What would people be most surprised about those early days?
I don't know. There were extremely few people making use of the net. The big change for usability came with the web. The big change for operationally came from always on. When you switched from dial-up modems to a connection in your house that was always there, that made a big change in how people interacted with the net. And that came in the later 90s. That was the big thing. But before then, there weren't very many people who were using it. The big change with ARPANET in '83 was that we were able to start training generations of students to use it, to know that it was there and to use it so that when they went off to their business, their jobs after college, they would demand the same kind of connectivity because that's how they were doing their research. Before that, nobody knew anything about it. And so nobody thought about it because they didn't know about it.
I'm just curious, was there anybody that was like, what if there was this potential to communicate in this way?
Not in the crowd that I was in, was the psychology department. We didn't have a whole lot of that. But it was there in science fiction and the like. Shockwave Rider, for example, predicted a global data network which people could communicate on, and a number of other science fiction books talked about it. And Shockwave Rider also predicted the ubiquity of a search engine like Google. There's a quote from that book which says, You don't need to know anything. You just need to know where it is.
You said science fiction, which is exactly probably what it sounded like. Did it sound like science fiction to you?
Well, Arthur C. Clarke's famous quote of anything of sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic, that's science fiction.
So what was it like to be part of the installation of the Cisco router?
Well, I put the first Cisco router in. I put the first router in at Harvard, and it was a Cisco router because Cisco was offering a deep discount to BitNet members, and so put that in. And it was nothing particularly special. What it mostly did was it made it so that my building, the building that I ran the network in at Harvard, was isolated from the rest of Harvard, so that if somebody screwed up someplace else in Harvard, it wouldn't affect my piece of the network.
Do you have any predictions for where we, in the next 20 years, the potential?
I've been predicting for the last 20 years and for longer that the internet can't continue to exist the way it has, in particular on the political front. The disruption of society is profound from what the internet can do. The very first international treaty on telecommunications was in 1865. It was the International Telegraph Convention. And one of the rules in that convention was that telegraph operators had to be able to stop any communication which might be seen as threatening to society or morals or the state. So this has been a worry for a very long time. And I've been predicting for 20, 25, 30 years that we were going to run into more and more of that. We were going to get more balkanization and the net was going to be broken up into pieces. We've seen some of it. China, for example, is everything goes through the Great Firewall of China. But even with that, there's an awful lot of communication that actually happens within China and between China and the rest of the world. I have been wrong in the amount of fragmentation that I've been expecting.
What do you mean by that?
There has been less fragmentation, less breaking up, less per state, per country breaking up to filter communications, less balkanization of the net. I've been assuming, a lot of people have been assuming for a long time that governments will not continue to tolerate this internet thing that provides information that they're not providing. By definition, most governments believe that the only legitimate information is the information they provide. And the net gets around that. China, in Cuba right now, the Cuban government has blocked the internet, and I think it's today or yesterday, President Biden was going to meet with some Cuban folks, some U.S. Cuban folks, to figure out whether they could the U.S. could provide internet connectivity to Cuba with balloons or something. I've been expecting for a very long time there'd be a lot more of that, and for whatever reason, there hasn't been. We haven't had the balkanization. We also haven't had the governance issue. For many years, since at least since the late 90s, the ITU and others have been trying to move internet governance, create an internet governance. There has not been any internet governance, but they've been trying to create internet governance and put it under an intergovernmental regime, particularly the ITU. And they've been trying to do that for all this time, and it's not succeeded. We've not had that, even though there's a great desire in a lot of governments to do it. But it didn't happen.
So, Scott, let's go ahead and open that can of worms you've already been mentioning. You have been talking about this for a very long time. In 1996, at a conference at the Harvard Information Infrastructure Project, you described two conundrums of the internet, and that was back in 1996. And those were, who says who makes the rules? Who says who pays for what?
Well, the second one is actually a misquote. I just said, who pays for what? Just those questions are still not answered.
Those questions are still not answered. Absolutely. So as we look at the complicated infrastructure of the internet today, those questions were very wise. What were the reactions during that time when you were asking those questions? Did they have solutions? Was it a prime focus?
Well, the reason to ask the first question, who says who makes the rules, was because the ITU and government agencies around the world, mostly telecommunications regulators such as the FCC in the US, were completely baffled that this internet thing had no governance. Nobody was telling it how to run. No one was telling it what prices to charge, how to interconnect, what services to offer. Nothing was doing that. There was no governance. So, and who was deciding what technology to use? Governments all over the world around that time were pushing something called the OSI protocol suite. And the U.S. government required it for a while, and it was required all over Europe. And that was an alternate technology to TCP/IP, the internet's TCP/IP. Who says who has to run what? Well, U.S. government tried, European governments tried, but the net kept going, kept using TCP/IP instead of switching over to the OSI protocol suite. Because there wasn't anybody identified and recognizing as the rule setter. One of the rules is who says who makes the rules. There's somebody that says this organization is designated as the Internet Standards Organization. There's nobody that can make that statement. Nobody can say ITU or IETF or somebody else is the Internet Standards Organization. It just happens. There was nobody that could state that, and nobody could state how you could who was in charge of deciding how much it was going to cost to do an international communication via the internet. The ITU tried. They had a proposal from Australia and a few other countries to make it so that it worked like the telephone network, where the instigator of the call would pay. That never happened in the internet. Every ISP has to pay for their own connectivity. And so the who says who makes the rules was an ongoing issue at the time and has been an ongoing issue all along, because the lack of rules, the lack of governance of the internet is a complete bafflement to governments. The fact that the top-level domain for Iran, was tied up in a Texas bankruptcy court for many years is completely not understandable to a government. How can the very identity of this country on the internet be tied up in a Texas bankruptcy court? It doesn't make any sense to them. But that's the way it was then, and that's the way it is today. We don't have that kind of governance, and it's a well-crafted whole. We definitely want the whole to be there, but a lot of people don't think it's a good whole to have.
So let's talk more about the current state of internet in terms of regulation and governance. What are your thoughts about what is going on right now?
Well, right now it's the same kind of muddling along that's been going on for quite a while. Individual countries are doing the Westphalian thing of deciding for themselves what goes on within the country. China and Russia and Cuba and many other countries are saying what is acceptable on the net and what isn't. The U.S. government tried to do that with the Communications Decency Act back in the 90s. Was shot down by the Supreme Court, which said it was unconstitutional to control what adults did on the net, even though the government wanted to control that. So governments are still trying to do that sort of thing, but there's no coalescing on the international scene of saying, like the Treaty of Westphalia did, was to each country they can control what's going on inside themselves. Hard to do in the internet because, among other reasons, because internet service providers go across countries. They're not just restricted to a country, though they are in places like China and Cuba.
What do you think the solution is?
That's asked as if there should be one.
Can you explain more?
You ask that as if there should be a solution. The main power of the internet after all these years, the reason it grew to what it is today and has the impact that it is today is because there hasn't been a solution. There hasn't been somebody that is in charge to say, do it this way. It's that individual ISPs, individual companies can experiment, can develop new technologies. Facebook came out of nowhere, came out of a dorm room in Harvard. And Amazon came out of a bookseller. They're incredibly powerful companies today, but they came because they were able to innovate over the generalized infrastructure that's the internet. The internet was not designed to support any particular thing. It was designed to support.
So then what do you think about in terms of the problems that were the conundrums that we're having? As you said, you asked that question as there should be a solution when the internet is a wild thing, essentially, in its nature. So what are your thoughts on how we rein the wildness in?
That also assumes that you want to do that. What I said, I was a witness for the American Library Association in the Communications Decency Act federal court. And I said in the court that the power of the internet was the chaos of the environment that you allowed, that supported innovation. And that's what we still have. The fact we don't have somebody saying this is what you can and cannot do means you can continue with the innovation. You can continue new technologies. And we keep seeing that. New services, new technologies, new applications. All you need is the general connectivity of the underlying connectivity of the internet. TCP/IP protocols. But even the TCP is changing. Google created a new technology called QUIC, which the IETF has now modified dramatically and standardized. And it supports the same side of things that TCP did, but in a better way.
So do you think it should just stay in its wild state?
It has been incredibly successful by doing so. But as I've said, it is a complete bafflement to the people that have traditionally been controlling telecommunications that we have this environment that has no controls.
I want to hear your thoughts on this. Recently, Canadian lawmakers passed a controversial bill that would regulate programming distributed by media streaming services and social platforms like Facebook and YouTube. Critics say this will infringe on individual speech. It's called Bill C-10, which will make tech giants comply with the same requirements as traditional broadcasters, effectively compelling companies like Netflix and TikTok to finance and promote Canadian content. It's among the most far-reaching plans by governments anywhere to regulate the algorithms tech companies use to amplify or recommend content. So in an age where everyone is a potential publisher, the act to amend the Broadcasting Act would affect individual expression on social media and other digital platforms that rely on user-generated content. What are your thoughts on this approach?
Well, it's an awful concept. It's an awful bill, but it's the kind of thing I've been expecting for decades. It's exactly what you would expect. Canada has been requiring, and France and a number of other countries require certain percentage of broadcast content to be locally produced because they apparently believe that their content providers can't compete in the open market, and they have to put a thumb on the scale to direct that even though the general audience doesn't want this content, the content has to be made available anyway. So not the straight marketplace of ideas. That's completely be expected. The area of requiring that certain percentage of Netflix be Canadian produced is, while it's kind of silly and it's protectionist and it goes against what the Canadian consumer actually wants, and it's really kowtowing to the Canadian producers, which are very, very much fewer Canadian producers there are Canadian consumers. That's not so much of a problem as worrying about whether this is going to actually impact what as you were reading, the individual person who wants to put up content and watch content. What is going to be the impact of C10 on that? Hard to tell. But it is just basically saying we don't trust the Canadian consumer to do what's right for the Canadian consumer.
Do you see the United States attempting to pass such legislation?
It wouldn't succeed. The First Amendment would block it. The First Amendment says that you cannot tell an independent service provider what to produce and what not to produce, other than things which are specifically illegal, like child porn. But the whole controversy over Section 230 is largely misdirected, because all Section 230 does is relieve ISPs of liability when they filter somebody, and somebody doesn't like being filtered. The ISPs leave. The Constitution says that they can filter anybody they want because it's their network, it's their service.
You mentioned this distrust of the average Canadian consumer in that way of regulation. Recently in Australia, they said that the problem was not so much in educating the average internet consumer, because that was a thought of the average internet consumer is just unaware of what they're signing up for and what they're giving power and permission for. And the argument was that it's not about education, it's that we need to protect. What are your thoughts on that?
That's always the excuse. There are two real excuses that are used for regulation. One is to protect the consumer, particularly to protect young consumers, children. And the other is to protect against terrorism. They're used for everything. They were used for the Patriot Act. They were used for Communications Decency Act. Those are the excuses that's used for everything where the government wants to control what you have access to on the net. It's always the excuse. It's not the reason. The reason is because the government wants to control what you can see on the net. Usually because the government wants to control information that, as was put in something a few years back, that would confuse the citizens. As you said about Australia, the citizens are confused in the government's mind when they're given information that the government didn't provide. The government, in all too many cases, the government wants news sources, including internet news sources, to reflect what the government has said, not to do their own investigation, to do their own work.
In terms of security, do you think there is ever a reason to protect the average internet consumer?
Not from content. And this goes back to, do you want to, there are extreme cases like ISIS recruitment. Do you want to protect consumers from ISIS recruitment? Well, maybe not. I mean, who defines something as ISIS? Who defines something as harmful or confusing to the citizens? Well, how do you regulate the regulator on that sort of circumstances? You can always imagine something which it's better not to confuse the citizen on. Fraud in general. It's all of these fraudsters that are trying to contact elderly citizens on the net and say, well, I'm from Microsoft support and your computer has been corrupted. I got one of those calls yesterday, even though I don't have any Microsoft products in my house. You want to protect against that, but how do you do that? Do you do that by banning certain classes of communication, certain classes of information, or do you provide alternative ways to get information? This goes to the desire right now with the COVID of, do you want to block people who are spreading false rumors about vaccines? The anti-vaxxers, is that something that's so abhorrent that you want to block them being able to communicate. Well, in the U.S., you can't block them because the government can't block them because they have a First Amendment right to spew their slime. But Facebook can block them because the First Amendment doesn't apply to Facebook. Doesn't restrict Facebook's operation. So Facebook can block them. The government can't tell Facebook to block them, though. The government cannot compel a third party to filter.
In a similar scenario as that you just described, well, that's not infringing on the First Amendment. So what other ways of regulation will we see on our own home turf that are legal?
Well, that haven't been ruled unconstitutional.
Yes,
the kind of thing where they did the excerpting the Section 230 to protect against sexual trafficking, which in the end actually made it much more dangerous for sex workers. It actually is very, very dangerous for sex workers.
Why was that?
Because that was a platform they were using to communicate about being attacked and about people who were attacking them and that sort of thing. And all of that was blocked. And systems like Backpage, which was cooperating with the police to track down traffickers, were stopped. And so it's actually made police's jobs harder. But it was a convenient thing for politicians to rail against prostitution. And we'll see more of that. They will be out there protecting the kids, protecting against terrorists. The politicians will do that all the time because it's a convenient excuse and it looks like they're doing something, and usually they're not doing anything useful.
So then what are your thoughts on how we go forward in the best method that keeps things innovative, that keeps things open, but also protects against, like, as you were saying, the scammers, the third-party ransomware?
Well, ransomware is almost always because of incompetent security. I mean, people set their networks up where they don't patch their systems. Their employees click on links for things that they don't know about. Their networks are set up so that the janitor has full access to all of the corporate secrets on the net, and that's just stupid. So mostly ransomware is a failure of the enterprise to properly do security. Protecting against it is futile if they won't patch the systems, for example, because they'll just exploit them. You can go after the people who do it and put them in jail and things like that if you can get a hold of them. But protecting against them is not something that you do by somehow saying you can't do that. That's just not going to work. But as far as the rest is concerned, there are real concerns. It's not that I don't think that there are real concerns. There is child pornography out there. There is people who would exploit naive users. So there are con artists. There are terrorists. There's some pretty bad people in the world. And trying to figure out, is there a way to stop that while not turning the net into pablum, as in baby food? It's an ongoing conundrum. We're going to be faced with that conundrum as long as we've got the technology. We had it with telephones. I mean, people were today, as I said, I got a call yesterday from Microsoft service about my failed computers. That's on a telephone. That wasn't on the net. It was on the telephone. And so we've got that same kind of thing in all kinds of communication media. We've got the old Nigerian letters. People send postal mail. Used to send postal mail with that kind of scam in it. There's no real change in that. It's old, faster, and more efficient for the scammers on the net, but it doesn't really change the underlying issues. And anything that there's no easy answer, and the problems won't go away.
What are we giving away in terms of, as you said, like that the internet turns into baby food. Can you talk more about that?
Well, first of all, there isn't any internet governance. So we don't have the issue. We don't have that problem right now because there isn't any. They're not able to settle on that, even though there's attempts. India wanted to restructure the entire internet protocol suite to make it completely controllable by the local governments. That's happening under the guise of what is called new IP in the ITU right at the moment. Huawei and China are trying to redesign the internet protocols so that they're completely under control. You would have to have permission before you could send anything on the net, including a request for the latest news. You would have to be personally identified before you could do anything. That would change the nature of the net to something which is revealing everything that you do. Those proposals are going to keep coming. And we have to be diligent against them because they seem like they would fix problems. They probably generally wouldn't fix the problems, but they seem like they would fix problems. And we've got politicians all the time coming up with stupid answers to complex problems. Most right now, Blackburn, a couple of politicians just put in another proposal to modify Section 230 to make it so that carriers such as Facebook could be penalized if they didn't block vaccine misinformation. Who's to say it's misinformation? Who's going to define what the misinformation is? Plus, it's unconstitutional because you can't tell what the government can't tell what the government cannot censor material that allows somebody to speak. First Amendment. And they can't tell the third party to do it for them for the same reason. It's First Amendment. So there's no easy answer. It's going to be. This is a conundrum. The conundrum comes from the fact we've got a flexible infrastructure, and that's not a bad thing.
What kind of questions should the average consumer be asking about the internet?
The average consumer has to understand how to distrust. Gene Camp, who used to be at Harvard, is now Illinois or someplace, did a whole series of things about trust. People trust by nature. Because when you stop, when you're driving down the street and you stop and you ask for directions, you're trusting the person you're asking to give you proper directions. Why do you trust that? It's to your benefit to get the directions, but what's the benefit of the person who is giving you the directions to give you honest answers? Nothing particular, but you trust it anyway. So the inherent nature is that when you get a piece of email saying that somebody has left you $10,000 or $10 million, and all you have to do is send $1,000 to pay the taxes, a lot of people will trust that. They shouldn't. Some things don't make any sense. So a message out of the blue saying that someone's going to send you $10 million worth of gold because they found it in Iraq or something doesn't make any sense, but people trust it anyway. And people have to know when to trust. You can't just trust everybody all the time, even if you are one that trusts people giving you directions.
Do you think educating would then be approach to, do you think that is the case to better educate the average internet consumer?
You can make them aware. Education is a difficult thing. There's a security paradigm, which is that users refuse to stay educated. You teach them something once and they stop and they will learn that and then they'll forget it. We had a situation a couple of years ago or a few years back at one of the schools at Harvard where a secretary clicked on a link that she should not have because there was no reason for her to ever do that. She clicked on the link and it corrupted her machine, and the machine had to be scrubbed, and the machine was taken away from her for a few days to get scrubbed and given back to her, and she was told, don't ever do that again. A week later, she did it again. And a week later, she did it again. She did it 3 times. because she just couldn't get it through her mind that what she was being educated about applied to this new situation. What do you do about that? So you can make people aware, but the next time something comes in that looks attractive, it looks like it comes from the boss, looks like it comes from their friend, you're going to click on a link you shouldn't. And if your machine isn't patched, it's going to get corrupted. Machine's going to be taken over, and your bank account's going to be drained.
So, what is your best advice to future internet professionals?
Security is a good field because there's so little of it, and the threats are so constant and evolving. It's going to be harder and harder to get jobs in managing pieces of the net because there are fewer and fewer of them. The automation is getting better. But there's still a future there, but it's more in the services, the applications running over the net than the net itself, whether the net is in your house or in an enterprise or the ISP. There's a lot more people working for Amazon than there are working for Comcast.
If you could have done anything differently in your career, would you have?
I don't know. I might have actually gotten a degree back in those days before, rather than dropping out. But no, I don't think so. I've been extremely lucky in the choices I've made. The fortuitous, and I mentioned I was the first person to put a router in at Harvard. A lot of my early success was in the fact that a friend of mine came to me and said, "Well, what's the performance of the Cisco router?" Because they worked for a competitor, and I said, "Well, I'll be willing to test that as long as I can test your router too, and do a comparison." And I did that for a decade. Was doing router performance comparisons, and that got me a lot of publications and a lot of publicity. That got me into the IETF, and therefore all of the work in the IETF and the exposure and participating in all the technology innovation that the IETF has done. And that got me into the Internet Society, got me into the Network World columns, which I did for more than a decade. So it's all been very fortuitous, all going back to testing a friend's router.
So what's next for Scott Bradner?
Well, I'm officially retired. I retired from Harvard 3.5 years ago. I'm focusing on ship modeling and some punditry, but mostly just taking it easy. I've done a bunch of driving around the country and things like that. Lots of pictures. There's one. The background is Shiprock, which is an Indian sacred site in Arizona, Arizona. Visited that a few times, and this is a photo that I took there.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. It's truly been a pleasure. I really appreciate all your thoughts, the past, the present, and the future of the internet.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.